Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Joshua Governale, and I'm with the Gian Foundation for Human Rights. I'll be moderating our discussion today. First, let me thank the Washington Kurdish Institute for hosting us and helping put this together, and thank all of our panelists who took time out of their days to be with us here. So we will start with a short introduction by Gian Foundation's founder, Salah Ahmad, and then I will introduce the panelists, allowing them a short time to speak. After, if time permits, we will take a few questions. If you do have a question during the panel, please put that in the Q&A. The chat box is turned off. You can write at any time during the panel and we will get to it at that time. We will try to get to all your questions that we can, time permitting. So as you all know, today we are discussing what role does the United States and its allies have in addressing medical and mental health support for the Kurdish and survivor communities after the end of the combat mission in Kurdistan, Iraq? So now I will hand over to Salah Ahmad, founder of Gian Foundation for Human Rights, for a short introduction. Salah, if you could unmute yourself.
Yeah. Now, can I start? Okay. Hi, everyone. I am Salah Ahmad, the chairman of Gian Foundation. I am a Kurdish man from Iraq. I born in Kirkuk, and Kirkuk was a big conflict city in Iraq. The conflict between Kurds and Arabs was every day. In the time from Baas party, we was and many people was victims from violence from government, and later the war between Kurds and the Iraqi army many years destroyed many families, many persons in this country. I saw this as a child. I grew and saw every day this violence. Make me to think about what's the solution, what we can find, what's the way to have a little peace in this country. What I done, I lived Iraq for many years, and I live in Germany. After that, I established the Gian Foundation for Human Rights in 2005. And we provide medical, psychological, social and legal services for everyone in this country. We haven't difference between religions. We have in some centers from us 5 persons from 5 religions will they work for this mission for human rights. Yazidi, Muslims, Christian, Kaki, Shabak, they work together in one center for peace for Iraq and Kurdistan. We have 12 centers in all Iraq, and we have a center in Syria. What we do, we provide not only treatment for the people, we have a mission for peace and humanity for everyone. We have many seminars for young people, for women-specific treatment, women which they slaved by ISIS. They sell them many times. They destroyed them psychological, and as a person, these people, they get the treatment only from Gian Foundation in a special clinic, which we do it since many years. All these services make, of course, needs many help and many people to work on it. And the financial times is very necessary for this, for the Gian Foundation. It makes me happy today to hear that so many people, they want to invite us and to hear to us what we have and what we want to do. And this unit make us very strong, and it make me so happy that we have many friends to be a unit for peace for the global and for the world. And this is something which it gives many power for my staff when they work in a very difficult situation in Iraq and Kurdistan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Salah. Now I'm going to call the panelists on gallery view as I introduce them. So we are very fortunate today to have the following panelists: Dr. Michael Gunter, Asma Ibrahim, Ambassador Peter Galbraith, and Dr. Anne Speckhardt. Now I'll allow each panelist to introduce themselves and give their opening remarks, starting with Dr. Gunter. Dr. Gunter, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to start by saying that I first met Dr. Najmuddin Karim, the founder of WKI, who died last year, unfortunately. I first met him back in April 1993, so knew him almost as long as Peter knew him, who knew him even more. I wish I had more time to talk about Dr. Karim because he was a very great man and he epitomized much that was good about the Kurds. But let me first now turn to the immediate matter at hand. The United States was seduced by the phenomenal success of the Marshall Plan, so began trying unsuccessfully to replicate it in underdeveloped countries that lacked the necessary economic, technical, and social development prerequisites Western Europe had. Afghanistan is a good, or should I say, a bad example of this. However, Kurdistan is more developed and thus offers, I think, better opportunities for US aid. For example, in Iraqi Kurdistan, I think the United States should continue aid to local and international NGOs, also the American University in Sulaymaniyah, the American University of Kurdistan in Dohuk, among others. The US should also continue aid to Yazidi NGOs doing mental health work and women who have been trafficked. The US DoD, acronym for Department of Defense, the DoD stipend for some Peshmerga has also been helpful. Now, despite many problems I will briefly mention, the Iraqi Kurds have the will to be a nation. They have an army willing to defend them, and even some of the economic prerequisites to successfully use US aid. However, what are the Kurds' problems? This is a huge subject, so I can only mention a very few important landmarks. With an estimated population of 30 to 35 billion people, the Kurds are famously the fourth largest ethnic group in the Middle East after the Arabs, Iranians, and Turks, and they are often referred to as the largest nation in the world without its own state. Actually though, the Tamils in India and Sri Lanka, among others, with maybe 75 million or more people, are the largest nation without its own state. Nevertheless, the historic Kurdish homeland covers where Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria converge in the Middle East. There's also now a large Kurdish diaspora in Europe, especially Germany, France, and Sweden, among others. There are maybe up to 50,000 Kurds in the US. However, unfortunately, as is also well known, the Kurds are divided. The Kurds are divided along geographic, linguistic, tribal, and ideological lines, among others. For example, from 1994 to 98, the Iraqi Kurds, fresh from their victory over Saddam Hussein, and with US help, living in their own semi-independent Kurdish regional government area, the KRG, nevertheless fell into a vicious civil war between their two main political parties, Barzani's KDP and Talabani's PUK. Earlier, the Iraqi Kurds, there were Josh, the Iraqi Kurdistan, the Josh were little donkeys, Kurds who supported the Iraqi government against Kurdish nationalists. Today, violent Kurdish disunity continues as the PKK from Turkey skirmishes against the KDP, KRG in northern Iraq. Turkey uses these Kurdish divisions to implement divide and rule tactics, as do Baghdad, Damascus, and Tehran. The Kurds also lack a homeland because after World War I, when the modern Middle Eastern states were created, Kurdish nationalism was much less developed than Arab, Iranian, or Turkish nationalism. To preserve their own territorial integrity, Turkey, Iraq, and Syria tried to assimilate their Kurds. As a reaction, Kurdish nationalism began to grow, but was also divided because the Kurds were separated into these 4 different states. There are many examples of how these states where the Kurds lived denied basic human rights and even committed genocide against the Kurds. In Turkey, their very existence was long denied, and they were called mountain Turks, who had just simply forgotten that they were really Turks. Now, of course, today Turkey recognizes the Kurdish existence, but many problems still remain that have led to challenges to the very existence of Turkish democracy, such as mass arrests of Kurdish leaders, limitations of the free press and judiciary, and so forth in Turkey. In other words, I would argue that Kurdish rights in Turkey are rights for everybody in Turkey, not just Kurds. Now, in the city of Halabja in northern Iraq, Saddam used chemical weapons to kill some 5,000 Kurds in March 1988. Saddam's Anfal movement was a genocide that killed maybe 180,000 Kurds in the late 1980s. In March 1991, 1.5 million Iraqi Kurds were forced to flee Saddam's wrath after the first Gulf War over Kuwait. Very successful US military and economic aid helped save the Kurds at that point. In 2014, ISIS attacked the Syrian and then Iraqi Kurds, carrying out genocide against the Yazidi Kurds in northern Iraq. Kobani in Syrian Kurdistan was the Kurdish Stalingrad in these great battles against ISIS. And once again, US military aid played an important role in the final Kurdish victory over ISIS. However, the US then allowed Turkey to intervene in Syrian Kurdistan in October 2019. Turkish mercenaries actually filmed their brutal murder of Hevrin Khalif, a female Syrian Kurdish leader during this attack. After the US evacuation from Afghanistan last month, Kurds rightfully wondered if the US would abandon them again, as it did in 1975, when Henry Kissinger cynically explained that covert action should not be confused with missionary activity. In closing, I note that in September 2017, the US also turned against the Iraqi Kurds because the Iraqi Kurds carried out a non-binding advisory amendment on independence from Iraq. As a result, pro-Iranian militias and Baghdad troops recaptured Kirkuk from the Iraqi Kurds, although I must note also that Kurdish disunity also facilitated this Kurdish disaster. Of course, there's so much more I could mention, but in the interest of time, must stop here. I'd be pleased, of course, to take any questions or comments later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gunter. We'll now be hearing opening remarks from co-head of Trauma Care and Health at Jian Foundation, Asma Ibrahim. Asma, you may take it away.
Thank you, Josh. Hello, everyone. And my name is Asma Ibrahim. And I really watched many events that the other panelists did, and I really felt pleasure to be here with you here, today, and thank you for the WKI for putting this together. And as Josh mentioned, I am the co-head of Trauma Care and Health Program at Gian Foundation. And I can say in my position, I have seen firsthand how the horror of violence caused by war, terrorism, and genocide, and has affected our families, friends, and also our community altogether. And you know, when I heard the news that President Joe Biden had announced the end of American combat involvement in Iraq, I really felt a wave of anxiety that shook me to the core. And it happens while we welcome the chance to strengthen our democratic institutions and have self-sufficient armed forces. And I know that many living in Kurdistan in the northern region of Iraq felt the exact same way. Most of my family are survivors of Saddam Hussein's terror campaign against the Kurds, you know, in the late 80s and the early 90s, as Professor Gunter mentioned. And, you know, people in Kurdistan suffer from transgenerational trauma, and I think you may know that it is an empirical behavior that passes from generation to next generation. And it is trauma that can be really paralyzing, rage-provoking, and could be hard to control. From family and friends who survived from Anfal campaign of 1988, to the thousands of Yazidi women, men, and children who escaped from ISIS captivity, our community have been severely traumatized by the endemic conflicts that afflicts our region. And we really have endured decades of genocide, rape, torture, forced religious conversion, and loss of our loved ones to the Ba'ath regime, ISIS, and many other multiple terrorists. And we can say that we are all survivors of transgenerational trauma. And you know, recently, since we hear that the Taliban recaptured the Afghanistan, and I think you can imagine that how news and images consistently bombard us, and we're really afraid that ISIS do the same in Iraq once the US military stops supporting us. And we heard that President Joe Biden has pledged that they are ongoing in assisting and also supporting us. But you know, what does that mean for us and other ethnic and religious communities living here? Because we need to continue and build more programs like psychotherapy and health programs, especially at Gian Foundation. And those programs address the root of post-conflict trauma and provide the, like a roadmap to stability among communities in the region, something that we can say that the entire world can benefit of it. One thing that I really want to share here is a story from one of my patients that she talked to me about her life, especially after the experiencing many traumatic events in ISIS captivity for nearly 3 years. And she mentioned that I sometimes don't recognize myself, and I totally changed, and I cannot sleep because of nightmares and overthinking, and I cannot feel safe, and I always expect something bad is going to happen. And she also mentioned I will easily be angry, and sometimes I will faint, and I cannot totally enjoy to be with my family and also the other people's as well, and because I cannot trust anyone, including my family as well. And something that drew my attention that she said, I noticed that my children behave exactly like me, and which when I see that, it really makes me disappointed and depressed at the same time. What we could do as a GN team, including me as a psychotherapist and also the psychiatrist and physiotherapist, medical doctors, lawyers, and also our social workers, we really work together to help this patient and also many other patients that we have especially in reducing the symptoms and really help them to have an easier life. And you know, when we listen to these real stories, it's easy to see how trauma affects not only the individual who experienced the event, but the people around them. And the effects of war and violence stay with us, you know, and then transfer for our children. And now, I think you can observe that we have the entire generation of people who feel the same as that patient, and that trauma affects our community and the ability for everyone to build a life. And finally, I just want to mention that I have personally experienced that how conflict can quickly grow when there's a lack of mental health care and community dialogue. And also intolerance and hate breeding can grow without mental and medical health care, political stability, and also the economic support as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Asma. We will now hear the opening remarks from Ambassador Galbraith.
Thank you. And my thanks both to the Washington Kurdish Institute and the Jihan Foundation. And I was very impressed to hear about the work of the Jihan Foundation. And I also want to share my appreciation of Dr. Najmuddin Karim, who was an extraordinary person. And it is because of him that I've become involved in the Kurdish question after I published a report for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee describing a trip I'd taken through Iraq, including for peculiar reasons up into the Kurdish region, and seeing the beginnings of the Anfal, the destruction of the villages. And I realized that significantly because of Dr. Karim, I've been a witness to these traumas that are being described. After I interviewed the survivors of the chemical weapons and got the Senate to pass sanctions in '88. I was in Iraqi Kurdistan during the uprising in '91 and was with the people fleeing to the mountains again back in April of the same year. There, days after the, before and then days after the 2003 invasion, there in 2014, when just after ISIS had attacked and taken Mosul, and there at the time of the referendum, and I have to correct my good friend Michael Gunter, it was not an advisory or a referendum, it was a binding referendum. That's what was described in the law. That was described by President Masoud Barzani. It just was not self-executing. So it didn't automatically lead to independence. And then I've made, I think, 16 trips to Northeast Syria since 2014. So I'd wondered what I had to contribute to this particular discussion of mental health, but perhaps there's something there. I also was the Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General to Afghanistan in 2009. And so I understand the concern that people in Iraqi Kurdistan might have in relation to what happened in Afghanistan. And I have to say the situations are totally different. And in Afghanistan, the United States intervened. It intervened with a local partner, the Northern Alliance, and then changed course in 2002 to engage in a massive nation building exercise, spent trillions of dollars, undertook much of the fighting itself, and everything it did collapsed like a house of cards. And of course, it was Trump that negotiated the surrender deal. Biden went ahead and implemented it, but the whole enterprise was a failure. You contrast that with the situation in Iraqi Kurdistan, where to this day, no American soldier has died in hostile action, where it is the United States has been supportive of a strong local government, admittedly with the problems that Dr. Gunter described, and a local force that is been very committed, or in Northeast Syria, where the Syrian Democratic Forces and their predecessors, the YPJ and the YPG, sustained 10,000 casualties, and the United States sustained 5 in the fight against the Islamic State. And that kind of intervention is very different. It is sustainable. And I also say a word about Joe Biden, whom I've known for 42 years. He was one of the senators on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He cares deeply and personally about the Kurdish issue. I know that. I introduced him to the Kurdish leaders in August of 1990, people that Najmuddin Karim arranged to come to the United States just after Saddam invaded Kuwait. The Jalal Talabani, Sami Abdul Rahman, Hoshir Zabari, among them. And he visited Iraqi Kurdistan in 2002 prior to the war, spoke to the Kurdistan National Assembly. He was a critic of Trump's decision to greenlight the Turkish invasion of Iraqi Kurdistan in 2019. It's not, I'm sorry, of Rojava in 2019. And it's not just him. His entire national security team are people who are deeply involved in this issue. And I might add that he's the author of a plan to partition Iraq, the three-state solution, which was a little different from what I had earlier proposed. My proposal was simply to argue that Iraq had broken up and we shouldn't try to put it back together. His went a little further and suggested the US should play a role in partitioning. All of that said, you have somebody who knows the Kurds, who is personally committed, and I don't see the same circumstances as playing out in Iraqi Kurdistan as played out in Afghanistan. The other important distinction is that the Taliban was a movement with a broad base of support among the largest segment of the Afghanistan population, namely the Pashtuns and the rural areas. And Afghanistan's about 2/3 rural. Pashtun areas maybe even a larger percentage of rural. These are people who benefited hardly at all from the 20 years of the American invasion, and who experienced those 20 years with night raids, bombings, deaths in extended families, a corrupt police force that would set up checkpoints and rob people on the farmers on the roads, or even go into villages and select young boys for sexual purposes. that again is very different from the situation that exists in Iraqi Kurdistan, but also Iraq is a country that's 60% Shia, 20% Kurdish. There isn't the same, and ISIS is a Sunni fundamentalist movement. There isn't the same base of support for ISIS to be able to come back and take over, Iraq itself or Kurdistan. Beyond the fact that the United States wouldn't allow it, and for that matter, I don't think Iran would allow it either. Iran was quite content in 2014 to have the US defend the Iraqi government, but when the US initially didn't, the Iranians sent in forces because they weren't going to lose their closest ally in the world. Finally, I want to just switch gears and say a word about the work with the Yazidi community. I've been very involved in reuniting, in fact, Yazidi mothers with the children that were born as a result of the rapes by ISIS. This took over 2 years, and it was over the strong objections of the Yazidi religious community, who considered these children to be an insult to the community. I'm sorry to say about that because I'm very sympathetic to the Yazidi religion and to its community, but I simply feel that we have to insist that human rights belong to the individual. The Yazidi religious leaders are entitled to their opinions, but the mothers are entitled to their children, and the children are entitled to their mothers. And those who have been victims of oppression ought not to be inflicting harm on people who are also victims. And of course, it's also the image of powerful men, an all-male religious leadership, imposing its views on young women who were kidnapped as teenagers and held as slaves for 5 years. So, and of course, I've spent time with these young women as a mental health matter. They're stunningly resilient, at least in my impression, but I'm sure there are deep, deep scars there. And they've had, there are difficulties in readjusting to the children were taken away from them, to be clear, by the Yazidi house in 2019. They were enslaved by ISIS for 5 years. The Yazidi house then took them away, the children were put in an orphanage in northeast Syria. The mothers went back to Iraq. And then it was over their objections of the Yazidi community that they were reunited. But I think that, it's very important to have compassion for the weakest victims when we talk about these things. And at least for me, these young women and their children are the weakest victims. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Galbraith. I would just like to remind everyone, I see a few hands popping up. If you do have a question, please type that in the Q&A part, and we will get to it shortly. Right now, I would like to move on to Dr. Ann Speckhardt for her opening remarks. Doctor? Oh, you are muted.
Thank you. And thank you for organizing this. I'm really enjoying listening to the other excellent speakers. I'm a trauma psychologist, and I've been working in the region for decades now, and have interviewed over 800 terrorists of various ilks, 271 of ISIS. So a bit of an expert on their brutality, which has caused a lot of trauma in the region, but isn't the only cause. When we look back since the Syrian civil war began in March 2011, we know that more than half of the Syrian population was forced to escape from their homes, and more than 5 million fled the country. And we've heard of other displacements from our other speakers, so I won't go into that. And we know that when ISIS came into the region, 2/3 of Syria and 1/3 of Iraq roughly fell under their brutal reign. Added to this were years of poverty, repressive regimes, sanctions, economic stress, terrorist activities, and war, which have all combined in the region to create serious mental health issues. Just as one example to give you an idea of the mental health issues in the region, in 2017, a team of locally trained psychologists and social workers made psychological assessments of 494 married couples, so about 1,000 individuals. These were all Syrian, Kurdish, sorry. I see it rings on my computer, even if I have my phone turned off. Sorry, that was my son. So about roughly 1,000 Syrian Kurdish refugees in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and they used a post-traumatic stress disorder checklist from the DSM-5 and the Hopkins symptom checklist for depression, which will mean nothing to many of you and a lot to clinicians. And in that population, they found that everyone had had experienced one traumatic event, and 86% had 3 or more traumatic events. And the prevalence of PTSD was 60%, and it was very close with depression. And they could associate this with gender, age, time spent in the camp, and the number of traumatic event types. I'm sure there's good population surveys as well for Iraq. I haven't found them. Interestingly, when you Google this in America, all you find is the trauma rates for the veterans that fought there, as though the Iraqi people themselves were not traumatized, which is kind of sad, isn't it? But when we think of PTSD in the region, we need to also understand this from a regional context. People in Iraq and Syria don't have just one trauma in their lives that they're struggling to overcome. The region has been hit for over a decade now, and longer in many places, as we just heard, with not just one trauma per person or per family, but a virtual tsunami of traumatic experiences and losses. And there is still not stability in place in many places needed to recover from traumatic experiences. We still see massive displacement, people living in camps, continued threats, and ongoing stress everywhere. So when we think of PTSD, we need to understand that we're talking about a near constant confusion about time and place, repeated reliving of traumatic experiences as though they're happening in the here and now, creating a sense of danger and a need to be reactive, constantly wanting to avoid and shut down the things that trigger the reliving, constant bodily arousal, loss of concentration. You know, if you're spending all your time focused on the dangers that you think are happening or about to happen, outbursts of anger, depression, sadness, survival guilt, and inability to function well in life. And as our previous speaker, Asma, told us, it's intergenerational. And it's not only in terms of behaviors, but we now have good research that trauma passes to the children in behaviors and as well in changing their genetic expression. When children are raised by parents that are numb, psychologically numb, grieving, angry, and not functioning well, the kids don't do well either. And if we think about trauma, it looks like 6-year-old Mustafa, who still suffers nightmares, cries at the sound of airplanes, occasionally wets himself, and saw his cousin and father wounded and killed in front of his eyes. It looks like the Yazidi woman that I spoke to in the camp, who seemed to be very resilient, as Peter said, but wasn't resilient at all, I found, as we went on talking, and not talking about really deep things, but suddenly fell over sideways, went into what looked like an epileptic seizure, but it wasn't a seizure, it was a reliving of the rape. And her family told me this happens to her whenever what she's been through is discussed in any way. And it sometimes happens a couple times a day. And it was horrible to see. I can't imagine how she lives with that daily. It looks like young men that would rather engage in martyrdom missions and exit this life to paradise, believing lies from jihadist groups, than continuing to live in a state of hyperarousal. So you asked me to address prevention, and what I would say is we need trauma-informed care, obviously, and we need a systemic approach, because you have to come at this from many different levels. First of all, we have to bring stabilization so that trauma processing can begin. Trauma survivors can't get better when they're still living in actual danger. because that's one of the things that you have to help them with, is to convince them that they're safe now. But if they're not safe now, there's no convincing, right? And providing safety requires good governance to ending conflicts. And that means that things have to stop, like our NATO ally backed Turkish rebel groups who are still raping, still torturing, still carrying out ISIS-like crimes in northeast Syria, to name just one thing that needs to stop. Prevention also involves a whole of society approach of involving and training teachers, religious leaders, psychologists, medical doctors to recognize trauma and to intervene. I worked on a program with IRIX where the US Embassy was funding an initiative to train teachers by the psychologists in Iraqi Kurdistan to recognize when the kids in their classrooms were losing their concentration, going into a flashback, falling apart, having angry outbursts, that these were trauma responses in the most cases and what to do about them. We need to destigmatize trauma responses. I keep hearing that in Iraq, it's become more normalized to seek psychological care because people are finally starting to admit to each other we're all traumatized and that it's really okay to go to a psychologist. It doesn't mean that you're, genetically crazy. It means you've lived through horrible experiences and you need some help. We also have to recognize that when people face life threats, of course they turn to their religion and they start thinking about the afterlife. When they face corruption and horrible governance, many people think that their religion could do better. And they don't realize that terrorist leaders are no different. And sometimes they're the very same people from their government that hurt them before that are now manipulating and saying, I'm going to bring you a religious state. I'm going to bring you good governance through Islam, when they have no intention of doing that whatsoever. So we need to educate youth, inoculate them about the lies, about jihad, about martyrdom, about hijra if they're thinking about moving. We need to show them how they can destroy their lives for a pittance if it involves earning pocket money from terrorists, getting some kind of adventure. I talked to so many kids that said they went to the ISIS training camps just to get a better meal. And when I asked them what were the meals like in the camps, they said they were just the same as at home. No meat, just rice and beans. And, to think that those kids are now possibly serving life sentences because they went to a camp for rice and beans, it's horrible. We also need to understand that the whole idea of martyrdom, suicide bombing sold as martyrdom, is also selling a type of self-medication. It's an escape for people that just can't stand suffering from PTSD anymore, because they're told you'll go immediately to paradise. And also for many people, this delivers a sense of euphoria. It's probably the brain delivering its own endorphin system as you consider committing suicide to kill others. And we need to educate kids that that's not at all what it is. It's not coming from Allah. It's coming from your own brain because you're in pain and because someone's convinced you to kill yourself. And those are some of the ideas I would suggest, but of course, it's a big issue and it's not something that I can tell you in 10 minutes the answers to. But it sounds like you're doing wonderful work with the Jehan Foundation. Bravo to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Speckhardt. So now we'll move on to the Q&A portion. We have a short time, so we'll maybe get to 2 or 3 questions. We have one really good question for Ambassador Galbraith and Dr. Ann. How can the Department of State expand their grants to aid to include PTSD communities? What are your recommendations for how the US can handle this issue? If either one of you would like to take this to begin.
I can jump on that because I know that when I was working 2 years ago, I was hired as a consultant to one of the grants that came through Public Affairs. So Public Affairs has rotating grant applications at the embassy. So anyone can apply. I encourage you to apply. And in the grant that I was involved in, they were teaching teachers with US money and working with University of Baghdad psychologists. And they were going into Kurdistan to train the teachers. What does a PTSD reaction look like in your classroom? What do you do with these kids that only went to ISIS school? What do you do when you're seeing these kind of things, and how do you intervene as a teacher? And then where are the resources in your community that you could refer to? Because, you know, a teacher may get over their head. And how do you approach this? This was all funded by public affairs. So I would imagine that if there's a need, and there certainly seems to be a need, you could apply again and the embassy would be interested to help you. That's through public affairs, maybe USAID, UNESCO, but you know, if you can show you're on the ground doing the work and you've got the trauma expertise, it sounds like, from what I'm hearing, and you know, feel free to ask me to help you if you need help, but I'm sure that there's Western donors that will help you, and the EU as well.
Thank you very much. We do have another question. It's not directed at anybody. It's from Cheryl Hardenden. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. The question is, are local people being educated to fill the need for psychosocial professionals? Who will employ them when they are educated? I think, Asma, you could perhaps answer this.
Can you read it again, please?
Are local people being educated to fill the need for psychosocial professionals? Who will employ them when they are educated?
It's kind of not very clear. The people is you mean general, for example, the survivors? You mean, maybe?
Well, I think the question is referencing, are there local psychotherapists and psychosocial workers in Kurdistan being hired? And I think, because you are one, so I thought this was a good question for you.
Yeah, of course. We need many organizations and centers, government centers to be opened, of course, for those people as well. And now many graduate students that graduated, they're not having jobs, of course. And I can understand that person that wrote that question, but maybe he just noticed that there's many psychotherapists and we can say psychologists that have certificates, but there's no jobs for them. Of course, it is the responsibility of government and also the international supports for the organization to expand and have opportunity for them to have works.
Okay, I think,
Can I jump in on that?
Definitely.
I don't know. Do you want to stay with the old model of everything's provided by government? You know, if you have a good service and people have needs, usually those two work quite well together. And I understand people can't pay a lot for these services, but if you have a certificate, if you're allowed to practice, why not hang out a shingle and say, you know, for small amounts of money, I'm willing to treat, because I think the need is overwhelming and you will get patients coming to you as long as you're allowed to do that. But why wait for the government to do it? They probably never will.
Yeah, you are right. Yeah, you're right, doctor. But you know, here, there's not allowed to do it alone. They should have a contract with a psychiatrist and work together. And many of them do that, but there's not enough psychiatrists for that can work with the psychotherapists as well. That's why, yeah, I said that.
You know, can I jump in this?
Yes, of course.
Okay. You know, we have in Iraq, we haven't any special psychotherapy schools, you know. We have only one in Dohuk. It is an institute. What Jian Foundation done, we trained our psychologists more than 2.5 years to be specialists for psychotherapy. And if you see in Iraq, the needs is very huge, but we have only a small number, and the most of them in Kurdistan, not in Iraq. But we need for the country an academy for psychotherapy where they can do this and they can train the psychologists when they are finished with the university. This is what we don't have it in Iraq. And we have very bureaucratic laws. Every psychotherapist must work with a psychiatric to work under his order to deal with clients. And some psychiatrics, they don't know anything about psychology. And this is something different, you know. This problem, we have it in Iraq, in all Iraq, you know.
Can you change the law?
Yeah, this is what we tried as Young Foundation now. We will establish an academy for psychotherapy. We have a deal with the university in Erbil and Koya to establish a center, and we have some partners in Germany. Maybe we have you in the United States to be in a cooperation between many organizations and universities to establish an academy which is accepted by the Iraqi government and Kurdish government.
Maybe you should include
Just to
Farm Salah's university, and then get somebody high up that will help you change the law.
Yeah.
Just to be clear, these laws are under the jurisdiction of the Kurdistan regional government, not Baghdad. So
Yeah.
if the KRG wishes to change Iraqi law, it can be done through the Kurdistan National Assembly and the KRG itself. It's not one of the exclusive powers. It's in fact not even a power of the federal government. One of the things I encourage people in Iraqi Kurdistan to do is to always remember that the scope of the powers of the KRG under the Iraqi Constitution are very large, far exceed the powers, say, of an American state. So basically, if there's a law you don't like, you can change it in Erbil. You don't have to go to Baghdad.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you everyone for your input. And in the interest of respecting everyone's time and ending on time, I think we will move ahead to closing remarks, which we will take in order as they were presented for opening remarks, starting with Dr. Gunter.
Okay. I forgot to identify myself. I'm a professor at Tennessee Tech University, arguably the leading public school in Tennessee. And I've been there for about half a century. And we're near Nashville, Tennessee, which houses apparently more Kurds than any other city in the United States, maybe 15,000, although nobody really knows. I learned a lot from this panel. This is certainly not my area, mental health, but with Dr. Karim in the past, I know that there was medical work done on survivors of the Halabja chemical attack in 1988, that cancer was endemic in the community from that chemical attack, so that medical concern for the Iraqi Kurdish population antedates this current situation by quite a bit. And Dr. Karim, who was a noted neurosurgeon, was very involved in this in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gunter. Closing remarks by Asma.
Thank you. And what I want to say that GN Foundation and other civil society organizations in Kurdistan really need more support for initiatives like our program for right and justice. That is one of our program here, and which plays an important role in coping with trauma survivors. And the program employs a team of lawyers who help ensure that the survivors have access to the rights as specified in international human rights law. And also programs such as our democracy and civil society needs to really be continued and grow as well. This program creates a safe space for dialogue about building a diverse, tolerant, and also democratic society in Iraq. And we also need more medical, psychotherapeutic, and also social support staff for survivors. And we need more health and mental care staff to travel to refugee camps, as Dr. Speckhardt mentioned. They're outside of the cities, and also IDP clinics and women's shelters, prisons, and orphanages as well. And we really desperately need ongoing resources to continue doing this type of work. And it is really crucial that the international community does not abandon us to groups seeking to destabilize our fragile democracy, you know, and because a lack of support and it will leave room for more violence in the future. And Kurdistan and Iraq needs a permanent program that will not only support the militarily stable Iraq, but also the physical and mental well-being of its citizens. And thank you for supporting our work.
Thank you very much, Asma. Closing remarks by Ambassador Galbraith.
Well, again, this was an educational program for me. I'm impressed by the work that the Jihan Foundation is doing. I guess I would leave with just a couple of thoughts. First, Iraq is not Afghanistan, and Kurdistan is not Afghanistan. And the important distinction, the important point is Kurdistan for all the talk about the international community, Kurdistan needs to rely on itself. Creating a house of cards like what was created in Afghanistan means a total collapse, or frankly, what was created in the Arab Iraqi army that totally collapsed in Mosul in 2014. The only way to provide security and good governance is to do it yourself. Some international, yes, but support, yes, but it is up to you. And also, I would say, take advantage of the powers you have under the Iraqi constitution, which are near total. And the final point I'd make is to come back to what I said at the beginning, which is the importance of being kind and supportive to everyone, including those who are unpopular with some communities. The community leaders cannot speak for everybody in the community.
Thank you, Ambassador. And Dr. Ann, you get the power play. You get the last closing statement.
Thank you. Well, it's been a great panel, and I also learned from the others, and I'm just very happy to know that Jayan is on the ground, starting to meet the needs. And we know that they are overwhelming needs and that trauma is ubiquitous. When I think of another example in the world, I think about the Balkans, when they had so much trauma, the mass rapes, the bombings, everything that happened there. The Western powers came in, and many did, and funded education for psychologists, social workers, psychiatrists. And now there's a really great PTSD expertise in the Balkans. And it sounds to me like the same is slowly happening in Iraq, and that you're part of it. But it sounds like there's some frustration. You either need to change your laws. I definitely would recommend not looking to your own government to solve the problem for you. What you're doing is great. Keep doing it, but look to outside funders to help you to empower even more people, change your laws so that they actually can do the work and earn a living doing it. And be confident that if the need is there and you have a great service, the two will come together somehow. Somebody will pay for it. And, you know, be crafty. If you have to go around it totally, in this country, as far as psychology goes, there's tons of people now engaging in coaching practices. Probably religious counseling, probably coaching doesn't fall under any law. You know, you could have trauma coaching, but find a way around it so that you can train up a virtual army of people to treat trauma, because that's how you're going to change your society. People like Asma described and I described, they're not functioning. And unless somebody helps them with their trauma, they're going to pass this lack of functioning to their children, exactly as was described. And you're just going to see more anger, more conflict, more failure in society. So train up your army and figure out how to get them paid. You're clever people, you can figure it out.
Thank you very much. That concludes our panel discussion today. If you've missed any of it, the whole thing will be posted shortly online. You can visit Washington Kurdish Institute or the Jihan Foundation to find that. Special thanks to the Washington Kurdish Institute for helping host this and put this together. And an especially big thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. I think it was a very good discussion, and I think we have a lot more to talk about and learn and think about from one another. So that concludes our discussion today. Thank you everyone for joining. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.